As many of you know, this is part of a SPIA webinar series where we meet every third Wednesday of the month. And the first few seminar series have tried to showcase the work that we have been trying to do by way of proof of concept to try and demonstrate impact at scale. We already saw some examples in previous seminars, and today is a continuation of that trend, except that the intervention that we're looking at and the country that we're looking at is quite different. So we're looking at stress tolerance rice varieties in Bangladesh. And we have 4 presenters here. I'm not quite sure how it's divided up. We have 2 presenters from the University of Arizona and 2 presenters from IRRI. So it's an excellent example of the collaboration that we are trying to foster between the CG centers and academic institutions. It's also an excellent example of how to do really great impact assessment by involving disciplines, not just from economics, but also from, for instance, remote sensing in this particular instance. So I don't think I need to say anymore. As before, we've requested the presenters to give us a sense of the journey that they have undertaken in meeting this challenge of how do we demonstrate impact at scale, and how they went about setting up the design of this study. So it's over to Jeff and Tom and Val and Renaud, I guess, or it's just Jeff, Val and Renaud. So I'll take it over to you. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mina. Yeah, it'll just be, I mean, Tom Evans from the University of Arizona is on the call, but we figured to try and simplify the logistics. So Tom will answer questions, but it'll just be myself, Val, and Renaud answering or presenting. So it's early morning here, so I'm still waking up and drinking my coffee. Apologize if I'm a little long-winded in the presentation. So as we said, how do we move forward? Let's see. My keyboard shortcuts aren't working. Oh, there we go. All right. So maybe, as many of you know, most of you know, about 2.5 years ago, SPIA issued a call for expressions of interest for estimating long-term large-scale impacts of CGIAR research. And so, you know, Carl Hughes presented a month or 2 ago about their successful application to this call for proposals. We also responded to this call, and so we kind of walk you through how we've tried to meet this opportunity by thinking creatively about how we can generate data in environments where we lack the typical social science data that we're used to. So there's this great opportunity to try and measure long-term adoption and large-scale adoption. And so the technology that we felt was best suited to this was stress-tolerant rice varieties. So Strasa, which was a multi-CG center project, had released at least a dozen stress-tolerant rice varieties over the past decade and a half. There's a lot of money poured into the Strasa project. A lot of successful genetic gains were achieved in the project. Developed flood-tolerant rice varieties, cold-tolerant rice varieties, drought-tolerant rice varieties. There's a large dissemination effort. A lot of what Strasa was doing is trying to bring the dissemination of these varieties to scale. And so there's been a lot of talk about how much seed had been distributed, how much seed had been produced, and there'd been a number of localized micro studies, including, I see Kyle Emmerich on the call, a great RCT that looked at the impact of a submergence-tolerant rice variety in East India, I believe in Bihar. I think it was in the AER. And so there've been studies, there've been the classic agronomic field trials to show that these things worked. And there have been RCTs to demonstrate the impact on yields and resilience of farmer income for those who adopted. But that kind of evidence doesn't really answer the question that SPIA was asking, which is, what is the impact of long-term and large-scale adoption? Kyle's study was over 2 seasons, but how do we look at the impact of adoption over 10 seasons? How do we look at the impact of adoption over hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of households? So there's been no systematic study of these long-term, large-scale effects. So, if you want to answer the question, how many people, what has been the impact of, let's say, Swarna sub 1, which is kind of the first of these submergence-tolerant rice varieties in South Asia, how many people are growing it now? What's been the impact over the 10 years that it's been out there? Has it been an effective investment for the CG? Does it contribute to the public good argument for the CGIAR? Problem is, there's no data. No data does not exist to answer this question. Despite the flagship status of Swarna sub 1 and all the money put into the Strasser project, there's no systematic effort to document adoption over time and at a large scale. There have been some data collection efforts here and there, but they were sporadic, and none of them were really designed to get at this question that SPIA was asking. So our problem is, well, this is a great opportunity. We think STRVs are a good candidate for speaking to this SPIA call, but we don't have the data that we would typically use as economists to estimate this sort of thing. So what do? In our case with sub 1 and other submergence-tolerant rice varieties, they're a technology that is amenable to observation from space. As you can see in this photo, when there's flooding, sub 1 rice responds in a very different way than non-STRV rice. And as you can see in this image, the contrast is pretty stark. And so that allows us to be able to, at least hypothetically, view rice growing in South Asia from space and distinguish between sub 1 varieties, or not sub 1 varieties, submergence-tolerant varieties and non-submergence-tolerant varieties. We wouldn't be able to tell the difference between what variety, STRV-A and STRV-B, but we could tell the difference between rice varieties that can stand being flooded and not. And so we can use satellite technology and remote sensing techniques to look at South Asia from space over a long, potentially a very long period of time, going back to the 80s, and look at when it floods, because we can see when it floods, look at how rice responds to that flooding by measuring some vegetative index, either NDVI or EVI, and then look at how rice responds to flooding. So if it floods, does the rice grow or does the rice die? We can combine that sort of data with administrative data from Strasser and other places about the distribution of seeds. And so we can use the distribution of seeds in certain areas I just got a message that says I'm offline. Okay, sorry, my internet seems to have gone out.
We can hear me again? We can hear you.
All right. I got a message from Teams that said I was offline. So we can combine the remote sensing data with the administrative data to calculate kind of what's the likelihood that a person has access to the seed. And then we can combine this with existing household surveys and new household surveys to try and get at the economic impact of growing the sub 1 varieties or the STRVs, because you can't measure someone's wealth from space. All right. So in March 2019, we submitted an initial EOI to SPIA. And the initial plan was to look at submergence-tolerant rice in Asia, developed by IRRI, and drought and cold-tolerant rice in Africa, which seeds were developed by Africa Rice. We're going to leverage the University of Arizona's expertise in impact assessment, Dr. Anna Josephson and myself, and in GIS methods with Tom Evans in the geography department. So the idea was simply we would use remote sensing data on rainfall, temperature, and NDVI, and that would give us historic data prior to the introduction of STRVs to determine the impact of weather on NDVI. So you look in the 90s and early 2000s before the introduction of these varieties, and you see that it floods 10 feet, and you see that the NDVI for rice drops 20%. And then the next year you see it flood 5 feet, and the NDVI drops the NDVI to exogenous weather events over a long baseline prior to the introduction of these STRVs. And then we take administrative data on seed production and dissemination. We'd use data on when the seed was released and how much was released, when it became available to farmers. And we can combine these two sorts of data and just employ a simple difference in difference framework to measure the change in NDVI that occurs after the introduction of STRVs. So the rollout of STRVs happens at different places at different times and with different levels of intensity. And so that gives us variation in our treatment, which is, might you be growing STRVs? And so we can use difference in difference and the existence of this long baseline prior to introduction and measure impact at scale. So this relies on the identifying assumption that during periods of abiotic stress, agricultural regions not cultivating these seed varieties will experience crop loss and the NDVI will go down. And so it floods, and these red lines would be grid cells viewed from space in which the NDVI declines after flooding. And it eventually recovers a little bit, but it never comes back to its pre-flood or potential maximum. And then the blue lines would be grid cells that are growing STRVs. And so it floods, but they don't respond. They survive the submergence and continue at high levels of NDVI. And then down here is when you begin to harvest. And so you should be able to see it, pick up this difference in signal, especially if we can look back at grid cells prior to the introduction of STRVs. So this is kind of our identifying assumption for in the EOI and in the proposal today. So SPIA got back to us in April. They gave us a tentative green light to submit a full proposal. Two things they asked for. They wanted us to document diffusion, that diffusion was widespread prior to the acceptance or funding of the project. So we need to go out and collect that administrative data to really demonstrate that dissemination was widespread ahead of funding of the project. They also wanted us to demonstrate that the weather shocks, the freezing, the flooding, the droughts occur frequently enough. The worry was that maybe there's only one flood in the last 10 years, and so there's just not enough shocks to actually pick up a signal. So we developed, with those ideas in mind, we developed the full proposal. In May, we went out, Varie, I believe is on the call, went out and collected administrative data in Bangladesh. We collected data in India from a number of different sources. Val will talk about that more. Unfortunately, Africa Rice wasn't able to get data to show the widespread dissemination of the seeds, and so Africa Rice chose not to continue with the project. So now it's just IRRI and University of Arizona, and the GIS teams were able to develop flood maps of flooding. Here's just Bangladesh. You can see from year to year, 14, 15, 16, the extent and variation in flooding. Some places always flood, but there's variety, and there's variety in the location, and there's also variety in the intensity of flooding. So with those issues documented. We submitted our proposal. We went through a couple rounds of revision. The primary concerns in these rounds were whether the remote sensing approach was feasible. You know, hypothetically, we can do this. As I laid out, the story is pretty simple. The question was really like, when we actually go and look at the remote sensing data, when we go and look at the images, can we identify rice? And is the difference between NDVI strong enough that can be picked up with current sensors on satellites? So one was, is this approach even feasible? And if it is feasible, do we as a team really have the expertise to implement these methods? And so through revisions, we added some more GIS team members, both at IRRI and the University of Arizona, and we split the proposal into 2 phases. So we've just completed phase 1 and submitted our technical report to Ricardo and Karen last week. And so phase 1 was basically a proof of concept that the remote sensing idea approach is feasible and that we can accomplish it. And we won't show you any results here, but we have been able to, I think we've been successful. We'll see what SPIA says, fingers crossed. Phase 2 will then expand the remote sensing analysis. We've just focused on Bangladesh so far. So we'd expand the remote sensing analysis for more years and for India. And we're also going to collect a round of household survey data that will help us validate the results that we are looking at through remote sensing techniques. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Val to talk more about the technology and the collection of administrative data.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, can everybody hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I will be giving you first a quick overview on the submergence-tolerant rice variety, the SWANA sub-1, and I will be discussing also on our effort in demonstrating dissemination and adoption data during the preparation of this proposal. So first of all, the submergence-tolerant rice varieties that we're talking about here, the SWANA sub-1, this was a variety that was developed through marker-assisted back-crossing of a sub-1 trait from the Indian rice cultivar called FR13A, and this was put into the popular Indian variety called SWANA. So one of the major characteristics of SWANA sub-1, which Jeff already mentioned, is that it can survive up to 14 days of full submergence. But under normal condition, several studies show that there is no significant difference in agronomic performance and also on grain yield and grain quality between SWANA and then the SWANA sub-1. However, in comparison to SWANA, it is shown that there is a 2-fold or higher yield advantage over SWANA after a submergence of 10 days if it happened during the vegetative stage. So this is just a quick, overview about the characteristic of the technology. So just here, you are visualizing a photo taken out of IRRI experimental field, which shows the SWANA, the sub-1 lines. And then you can see that after 17 days of submergence, they're still surviving and growing well, while the other varieties could not stand the submergence. This is evidence from the experimental field. In the farmer's field, this is also one here, a picture in the field of the farmer in Odisha. That was many years back. So here's on the left, there is the farmer standing in the middle of the submerged rice field on July 31 in 2008. And you see after 3 months, in the same field, you can see the SWANA varieties surviving and then growing well. So another evidence in the field. So throughout the preparation of this proposal, as Jeff mentioned, we have been seriously engaged into collecting data to show evidence of dissemination and also adoption. So what you see here on the left is the framework that describes the seed production and dissemination in Bangladesh, for example. So there are 2 main institutions involved into the release of new stress-tolerant varieties and mainly breeder seeds are released by the Bangladesh Rice Research Institute and also by BINA, which is the Bangladesh Institute of Nuclear Agriculture. So these releasing the new stress-tolerant varieties and then releasing the breeder seed. And from the breeder seed, the foundation seed are obtained, and there are other organizations now involved in the multiplication, and then later on the dissemination is ensured by organizations like the Department of Agriculture and Extension, some private companies, some agricultural ag dealers, and also some farmers association. So that is briefly how the process of production and dissemination works. In terms of what we have done so far in collecting the dissemination data, we first went back to those organizations, BIRI and BINA, to try to have a good overview, an idea about the total quantity of the STRV breeder seed that were produced. And then from there, we were able to gather the list of all the organizations who actually receive breeder seed from there. And that was very useful for us to make our contact to collect data from them. And with regard to seed production and marketing, we identify all the major organizations who are producing STRV seed. And through multiple visits in the local office of these organizations, we were able to collect data on seed production and also on seed sale. There were also a lot being done by some small organizations. There were many of them, and in many cases, we just have to estimate that. But when you look at the major organizations who are producing the STRV, they represent up to 80% of the total. So the total seed supply that was estimated at the end was validated by several seed specialists, and also we also use this literature and also the household adoption data. So what you see here on this figure, it shows the total amount of STRV which is produced in each division in Bangladesh each year from 2010 all the way to 2018. So you can see that at the very beginning, there was very little STRV seed being produced in the very first year. But after the introduction in 2010, for example, you can see that up to 8 tons of seed were produced. And then later on, in the second year after introduction, the number has grown quite significantly. For example, you can see that in 2012, for example, nearly 1,000 of STRV seed was produced. But starting from 2013, the Bangladesh Agricultural Development Corporation has consistently produced over 2,000 tons of seed, STRV seed, which account for around 13% of all almond rice seed, which is produced at that time. So you can see from the legend and the color for each of the districts involved here that the countrywide STRV production, is mainly led by effort done in districts like Rampur, Barisal, and also Dhaka. But it's also obvious to see here that the tonnage has increased in every one of those divisions. So in addition to those seed production data that we collected, we also we also use the adoption of STRV, which was measured by the IRRI Rice Monitoring Survey. So I'll be talking about that in a moment. The Rice Monitoring Survey project was funded by BMGF, and the primary purpose was to monitor the rice system with a focus on capturing varietal turnover over time. So, the way the project was designed, it was mainly to document adoption, not to measure impact. But in the context of our project, this rice monitoring survey is very useful for the work that we are doing. As you can see on the screen here, there's a panel of household data, 2014 and 2017, covering 4,800 households in India, almost 1.5 thousand households in Bangladesh. In addition to that, in between 2014 and also in 2017, there were also some cross-sectional data being collected, like, for example, 15,000 households on which data were collected in India, and 3,000 households on which data were collected in Bangladesh. Another important feature that needs to be mentioned here about the RISE monitoring project here is the DNA fingerprinting work. So about 20% of the households were selected randomly and on which the DNA fingerprinting were performed. So overall, the RISE monitoring survey is one of the major survey, that the household survey that help us in preparation of this work, and still at the moment this project is still going on. So in India, we have struggled quite a lot to obtain the administrative data on STRV production. That's why we presented mainly the information on Bangladesh. And this was also, it became more complicated with the COVID situation. But still, from the RMS data, you can see here the adoption of SUB1 using the village census from 2014-2015. The major areas with high adoption of the SUB1s so far are Odisha and Rangpur, and we have adoption of 2% and 4% between Assam and West Bengal. So this is, as in the phase one of the project, even though we focus mostly on Bangladesh, the plan was also to try to collect the dissemination data in India. But so far, with the restriction with the COVID pandemic, we haven't been able to complete that yet. So there were challenges along the way, and this is going to be useful also for those who are developing the project and also looking for, to show evidence of dissemination data. Most of the time, in most of the organizations that we visit, there is no proper data record being kept. So it becomes even harder when you need disaggregated data, for example, at the district level, and when it's disaggregated by variety, on location, and also when you're looking for historical data. So there's quite challenges. Most of the data are also recorded on paper, so we have to make photocopy, get people to reach out to the local office and talk to them, build the trust, and then be able to let them to provide the information to us. On many occasions with the public organization, we've seen a lot of resistance. They are not always cooperative in terms of sharing data, and also, especially the private organization, they're very reluctant to share some of the data. One other thing that is also a major challenge is, we have to conduct multiple visits in the local office, sometimes to conduct some discussion over the phone. Another challenge also to be mentioned here is that not all the seed produced are sold. So, we really have to make some assumption at some level. And then finally, for the farmers also save seed, they recycle, and then they also share. So these are so many other complications that were taken into account when we were working on, gathering the dissemination data. So I will now stop here and hand it over to Renaud to start talking about the remote sensing solution.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Can you see my screen? Also, remote sensing solution. So yeah, thank you for giving us the opportunity to report on this project. The remote sensing solution, I guess it should be better said the best bet solution. Yeah.
We just see your Microsoft Teams screen.
You see the screen, but not the projection of the slides you may have.
This one? You should be able to see it now.
Now it's working well.
Yes, now
Now
Let me get the start from current slide. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, as I was saying, it's more a best solution than a perfect solution. It's always important to mention that when we're talking about remote sensing. We are always facing a number of challenges that I'm going to discuss during this presentation. So based on what Jeffrey and Val said, the core objective was actually to try to document the adoption of the flood-tolerant seed. And from a remote sensing perspective, this meant that we needed to gather data around three steps, if I can put it that way. One was actually to document where we have rice production, rice area. The second is and where we don't. The second was where we have occurrence of flooding and where we don't, or to which intensity we do have this occurrence of flooding. And the last one was actually to derive for this area a number of metrics, especially in terms of phenology, post-flood phenology, or during season phenology, looking at peak of seasons, vegetation index, looking at flood metrics, which could be then related with the information that we have on seed dissemination. It's important to mention that the key challenge in the whole process, and especially at the level of the analysis that we are undergoing now, is the fact that we don't have a very detailed information about where flood-tolerant seeds are actually used and where they are not. The information that we have is at division level. So when it comes to analyzing these data with remote sensing, which are implicitly very spatial, these create a number of challenges. So the first step was obviously to choose the data that we would be working on, and we've at this stage proposed to actually use the MODIS platform. This was for several reasons. The first one, and the most important, I guess, from my point of view, is that it's daily imagery. So that allow us to actually use the temporal signature of the growing rice to better identify it, to better discriminate it. And also, very importantly, is that during monsoon season in this region, there is a high cloud prevalence. So having daily data here summarized into 8-day composite would actually, to a large extent, reduce the problem of cloud. And then finally, these data are available for more than 2 decades. So allowing us to go back historically, back in time. No? So we selected on the project 3 years to have a higher look. The first year that we worked on was in 2007, from June to January, which correspond to the Amman rice cropping seasons. And this was actually the reference year pre-dissemination of STRVs. And we used 2 years post 2010-11 when the seeds were introduced as a post STRVs exercise. So once the data was selected, we needed to do the rice area classification, the rice area mapping. For this, there was 2 key steps. First one, as you can see on these graphs, we use EVI data to actually map and extract the rice. These EVI's time series are, as I said, quite rich from a temporal perspective. But as you can see, where there is dotted line, there is some gaps, again, due to cloud. So we need actually to fill this gap through interpolation. And there is quite a bit of sharp peaks, which indicate presence of noise, which need to be smoothed using different filter. Here we use the Savitsky Golite filter. So this from the original red line, so then we could generate a much more smooth feature preserving EVI, which is shown in blue. Once these data were made available, then we use an algorithm to actually extract the rice area. Here you have, in green, you have the EVI, typical EVI during the season of rice growing variations. And in blue, we have the same variation for a rice field, but considering a land surface water index. Basically, I don't want to extend too much on that, but the principle of the classification involves 2 steps. One is to detect the agronomic flooding start of the seasons, which is the brown points that you have on the left. So that's when the EVI is actually higher than the land surface water index. And from there, we can identify the max EVI, where you've got the green point in the middle of the graph. And we have a rule that if we detect an increase of the EVI for a number of seasons in a consecutive time and with a specific amplitudes, then it's automatically classified as in rice. So next, rice area validation. So we needed to assess the quality of our product. So for that, we selected 250 MODIS pixels in two different rice registering regions in Padma and Brahmaputra. 125 points in the area classified as rice and 125 points in the area which were not classified as rice. Of course, historic data and lack of access to ground, we needed to rely on the photo interpretation of Google Earth imagery. And we did that exercise for the 3 years. Because of the so-called mixed pixel issues, which is a bit exacerbated in the MODIS type of data, we validated by looking at only area where we had photo-interpreted more than 70% of rice and less than 30% of rice, to be a bit more conservative. These are the results of the validations data that you can see on the table. Overall, we are around 70%. We can note that for the 2017 data, we have a higher accuracy than for the 2007 data, which are the older data sets. I mean, I think that there is several issues which need obviously to be mentioned in terms of error source and limitation, the mixed pixel issues, since it's a 500 pixel size that we need to expand now on at 250 meters. Obviously, there is a kind of a relatively large gap between the rice field size and the pixel size. Rice field size is a few hectares, or maybe 1 to 2 hectares max. But generally speaking, I think that many of the production in Bangladesh are quite contiguous and quite dense in terms of rice production, and so it should not overly affect the results. But other issues are the fact that the algorithm is based on what we call a so-called identification of the agronomic flooding. So when you have area where there is maybe a more direct seeding of rice, that flooding is non-existent, so the algorithm would not be as performant. In addition, the Google Earth data have variable quality, different pixel size. Google Earth is an amalgamation of different type of data taken at different time of the year, so maybe some seasons which are not necessarily the best to identify rice. The radiometric calibration of the imagery is different, so you have different colors. And also the historic image density, so you have more image now than you had in 2007. So all these factors makes a little bit more difficult to actually interpret the data, especially for the earliest year. And also flood event, need to mention that flood event will also probably alter the signature of the rice. Okay, big question, alternative remote sensing data sets. Obviously, in the proposal we mentioned Landsat, and so that's an important point that we've been thinking quite a bit about. Ultimately, the criteria that we needed to use to decide on which data we would need to be relying on were the one which are listed there. So large geographic coverage, Bangladesh, Eastern Indian state, large historic coverage, frequency of data acquisition, as I mentioned, to be able to build a temporal signature. Spatial detail is important, and also obviously imagery cost, so we cannot invest in imagery, so these need to be free. So I basically listed here the different options that we had. MODIS, Landsat. So Landsat, it's a potential contender since it's high resolution and available for a long time. But it's cloud sensitive. It's repetition. It's only every 16 days. If you compare to a 120 days of crop duration, and you have a few snapshots with clouds, that can complicate seriously the extraction of the rice. And then there is more recent tool like Sentinels, especially the radar, which are non-cloud sensitive, high resolution, high revisit, but the problem is that they are only available since 2015. This is an example also of, so beyond the rice area, we extracted the start of season. It's quite interesting here. So we can see that in green, the start of season was in August, and in yellow in June. And you can see on the left, on the 2007 image, that generally speaking, more green in the west and more yellow in the east. And that could actually correspond to higher rainfall in the east and lower rainfall in the west. So accumulation of water would actually go quicker on the eastern side. In 2016, which is a El Nino year, and we can see that there is more difficulty for the algorithm actually to detect the start of season, and it seems to be probably a bit later. Now the next step was to assemble the flood datasets. So we decided to go for the NASA Dartmouth Flood Observatory datasets, where they have extracted flood, and you can see on the right all the different flood data from the project. It's important to mention that one of the limitations of that datasets, I mean, beyond the fact that it's also quite coarse, is that it has been developed prior to 2011, but the data available prior to that date are quite sparse. Since that was corresponding to the algorithm development, and there was only ad hoc monitoring, so only big events were monitored. So we noticed that the quality and the exhaustiveness of the data sets pre-2011 is actually much less than post-2011. In addition, these data sets has some kind of limitation in capacity of determining flood in dark terrain, complex terrain, shadow and clouds. It's still an optical system. It's also an issue. So we did some comparison with actually Sentinel-1 radar systems. This is the result that we've got in pink, light pink. This is what Sentinel has detected that MODIS has not. In red, this is what both systems have detected. So we can see that this is in Assam in India. So we can see that MODIS is missing quite a few flood. Nevertheless, I think that Assam is a more complicated type of terrain than Bangladesh, where in Bangladesh you have more bigger flood plains and coastal land. In Assam you have a more complex terrain. So I think that's what explains also quite large difference between the two different types of products. But I think it's interesting still to report this and the potential of Sentinel to provide flood information. Here we've compiled the flood frequency with the MODIS data, and you can see that. So flood frequency means that we've compiled for the last 10 years how frequent do you have floods in the landscape, and so the maroon area are almost every year, and the yellowish, while the greenish are 1 year over 2, and the bluish are 1 year over 10 years. And we've compared that with the household surveys, just to give an idea actually of the correspondence between the fieldwork and some of the highest impacted area in terms of flood. I think this type of product, if you compare with the rice maps, for instance, could be used to help target field work in the area where there is highest flood frequency and potentially higher benefit, obviously, of adopting flood-resistant crop varieties. This is the results we had on the flooded rice area. So we overlay then the rice area to the flooded area, and identify on the table on the left the proportion of rice area, of flooded area, and of flooded rice area. Important to note that there is a decreasing trend of flooded rice area across our data sets from 2007 to 2017, which is quite obvious. Then once we have these things, these different data sets, the final step before we could start the analysis was actually to derive a number of metrics. I come back to my earlier graphs. And just to give example of metrics that we've been extracting for each pixels, either pixels which were rise or pixels which were non-rise, as well as pixels which were flooded or non-flooded. So we systematically extracted the start of season dates, the peak of season EVI, so the estimated maximum EVI and indicating the vegetation growth. We also extracted the EVI slope between the start of season and the maximum, the peak of season EVI, and giving an indication of the growth rate, and with the assumption, obviously, that area impacted by flood would have a much less growth rate than the one which are not impacted by flood, and to try to be a bit more synthetic over the whole duration of the EVI curve. We also extracted the EVI area under curve, kind of an integration of the signal. These are some example of derived metrics with the maximum and vegetation on your left, both for flooded rice area in red and for non-flooded rice area in green. We can show that in some of the flooded rice area, there is dark colors which indicate low EVI, so potentially low EVI and hence potential high impact of the floods on the crop. And you have also more light colors, so with high light pink, so with potentially higher EVI and hence a crop which would have still performed in a post-flood type of environment. Extracted also a flood index, which corresponds to a kind of an estimation on the severity of the flood on the crop, and it corresponds to a percentage of time during which the specific crop seasons, based over the 4 months of growth, has been impacted by floods. So it can be 10% of the time, 40% of the time, etc. So these different products now are actually been started to be analyzed by the economic team, by Val and Geoffrey, but we're not presenting that now. So now options, I mean, based on what we've been discussing, obviously one option, it's obviously what Geoffrey has mentioned, which is to extend to multiple years, to more than 3 years, and still work with MODIS. We can also start bringing on a Landsat with a similar multi-year pre and post 2010 analysis as we did. Advantage, as I mentioned, it's obviously less mixed pixels, so higher field detail. However, mapping accuracy with, especially as I mentioned, potentially sparse temporal time series, I think that's potentially still a hurdle, actually, and a difficult point. Also, the flood mapping would still be relying on the DFO, which quite coarse, irregular historic flood data set. So the historical part of the comparison is a bit challenging, if I can put it that way. And also, if we need to link optical data empirically to yield, that's also a third difficulty that we will need to address, and which is not an easy one, considering the fact that we don't have access to field data on yield. To develop these models. Another options which could be envisaged is, instead of having or in addition of having a pre-2010 and post-2010 analysis, would be to try to target a given year, 2021, 2022, where we can have an access to the field, do some solid calibration and validations, also survey, and then target, identify area where there is known variety usage, be it resistance or non-resistance, and then to directly link that information with detailed map rice area map based on radar systems, based on Sentinel-1, where we can guarantee a much higher mapping accuracy and a detailed map at 1 to 2 hectares, and where we have also developed I'm not going to describe too much the graph on the right, but where we have developed the technology to integrate radar systems with crop growth model based on the horizon to actually also output yield information at the same time. So based on this information, we could have a detailed information of where which fields where there is an adoption, which field where there is no adoptions, and focus on analysis of the post-flood signal using this type of technology. That's another option on the table. Here you've got an example of actually of the product that we've been developing using SAW technology in India, actually in one of the area of potential interest in Andhra Pradesh. The top one is the rice area, and the bottom left, the bottom right, it's the yield. So yeah, that's where we are, and I leave the floor now. I think it's to Geoffrey to kind of conclude and put all this work in perspective.
Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks. Sorry, Renaud. Like I said, it's early here still. Everyone can see my screen again. So, want to kind of in the last 10 minutes wrap up or try and kind of synthesize what we've learned from the project and from trying to see a call. Sorry. So, I mean, looking at the people on the call, most of the people on the call are social scientists, or kind of the Milia focal points in the CG centers. And so this slide isn't going to, the slide tells a story that all of you are aware of, that the CG centers, relative to, to other development aid organizations that are focused on research, continue to lag behind in funding for Milia, specifically for the IA part of it, the impact assessment part, which is where I work. So the CG has this missing data problem. We keep developing new technology, disseminating that technology, talking about the success of that technology, but we still have to fight for every dollar to get money to do proper impact assessment. These CG interventions get developed and disseminated without any sort of plan to collect data on the adoptions on impact, or even if they do collect data, there was not an appropriate research design as part of the data collection effort that would allow us to establish causality. Just among products that I've worked on with CG centers, Sub-1 at IRRI, C88 potato at SIP, fertilizer microdosing at ICRISAT, 10+ in Brazil at CIAT, Smart Valley with Africa Rice. These are potentially very impactful technologies, but we lack the data to demonstrate that. This is why SPIA was created. SPIA, with its calls, with Kieran's leadership, donors, Bill and Melinda Gates, governments that in the countries that we work in, and then as researchers, the journals that we submit to are continuing to demand better, more strongly identified impact assessment. And so the situation is improving, but as all of you know who work within the system, these are big institutions. It takes a long time to change culture. And if we're moving to a one CG, just imagine how much longer it might take to change that culture. So the problem, I mean, we're all aware of it. I see, over the 7 years that I've worked on SPIA-funded projects, I've seen changes and improvements, but the problem hasn't gone away, and it isn't solved. We still struggle, to get just some money to demonstrate impact in an incredible way. That's the problem that we have with Sub-1. When they rolled it out, no one was like, oh, hey, maybe we'd like to see what the long-term large-scale impacts are of this. There was, this is not to, for sub 1 there's that RCT in Bihar, and so at least with the rollout of sub 1, there was the idea, the recognition that, oh, well, we should try and identify the economic impacts of this, and so there is an RCT from the early days of sub 1, which is unusual. I would say unusual for a lot of those technologies CG has developed. So in our case, digital technologies, we've heard a lot about digital technologies and what they can do for us, and in a lot of cases they can help fill these missing data gaps. In our case, remote sensing allows us to look back into the past, pre-2011, all throughout the last decade, and allows us to partially fill in the gaps for areas that data was never collected. If you're doing something other than our project, you can use remote sensing to look at hard to reach places that may not be safe to visit in person. I know Tom Evans on the call. He's worked a lot in Zambia with these weather station pods. They allow us to collect a lot more data from a localized place than remote sensing would or a standard weather station would. There's recent work on moisture sensors. You can buy very cheap moisture sensors now, put them in the ground, and these can give us a lot more data and more accurate data on growing conditions. Seen presentations about wearable tech. It's hard, and we all know it's hard to measure household labor. Wearable tech allows us to get a sense of that. Cell phone data collection. I'm working with the World Bank and Talip right now. Like, cell phones are saving us in our data collection efforts as part of the LSMS ISA. In addition, for these digital technologies can fill the gaps where we don't have standard social economic survey data. They can also help address the issue of measurement error, which is over the last 5 years been a critical concern in the impact assessment community. Work by a number of different authors, Talib Killick, Chris Barrett, others have shown that both classical and non-classical measurement error can introduce noise and bias into our results. The inverse farm size productivity hypothesis is something that seems like was only just an artifact of bias in non-classical measurement error. So these GIS systems, handheld devices, crop cuts, things like that, can greatly reduce the error in self-reported data. So there's a lot of promise to these digital technologies. But as and I guess when Val and I first wrote up the EOI for this grant, we really had kind of rose-colored glasses on. We thought, oh, well, we know that these satellite products exist, which should be fairly straightforward to go back and do the impact evaluation using the satellite products. But as SPIA rightly brought up, just because it's hypothetically possible doesn't mean it's practically possible with the data that exists. And so Renaud and Tom really, as geographers and GIS specialists, really opened my eyes as a social scientist to some of the limitations, the qualifications that are needed when economists want to start working with remote sensing data. As Renaud said, there's no perfect satellite product that gives us exactly what we want. For our case, we need timeliness. We need the product to be almost daily so that we can get over the issue of cloud cover. We need something that has high spatial resolution so we can identify the small 1 to 2 hectare parcels of rice. And we need longevity in that sensor so that we don't just go back 3 years or 5 years, that we can actually go back a decade or more. And none of the existing products that are available free fit or deliver on all 3 of these. Right? Each one has advantages and disadvantages. MODIS has high temporal frequency, but it's only at 500 meters. Landsat has a long time record and high spatial resolution, but it only returns every 16 days, which in a rice growing season during the monsoon may mean that most of your observations are covered in cloud and you can't see what's going on. Sentinel has high spatial resolution, the radar version can get through the cloud cover, but it's only been up there for half a decade. And so we can't go back, at least in the STRV case, we can't go back to a pre-STRV time period with Sentinel. So, in our case, STRVs, we can identify them from space. SPIA has funded work that uses remote sensing to look at conservation agriculture. So some CGIAR technologies are amenable to using these new digital technologies and using remote sensing, but a lot of them are not. We could never, I work on a microdosing project at IRRI, we could never identify where people are microdosing from space. You can't identify the color of the flesh of a sweet potato when it's in the ground. So remote sensing can't work for every technology. And for the technologies that it does work for, you need to keep in mind all the caveats and kind of as second best scenarios that you'll find yourself in. As Renaud said, it's not a first best, it's a second best. We combine a variety of data to try and triangulate what's really going on. And we can use Sentinel in MODIS in a combination with Landsat and administrative data and household data. And hopefully by, bringing all these types of data together, we can identify, clearly and consistently identify the impacts of STRVs. You listen to your DGs, you hear a lot of talk about big data, digital agriculture, and I guess the thing I keep coming back to that these are frequently presented as substitutes for good kind of classic impact evaluation research design. And I keep telling people that these technologies are complements, they're not substitutes. You're not gonna get rid of your IA people because you have digital agriculture, whatever that means, or you have big data. Big data is nice, but it doesn't get around the causal problem. As we continue to try and meet SPIA's requests for impact assessment, we always have to come back to these kind of three key issues. We need to have good, credible models of causal behavior. We need our economic theory. We need directed acyclic graphs. We need theories of change. We need to be able to understand the behavioral aspects that make people do what they do. We're not agronomists. There's not some sort of biophysical response. We're trying to model behavior. We need, credible identification strategies. Just having a bunch of data isn't going to get you causality. You need experimental research designs or quasi-experimental research designs that allow you to statistically identify impacts. And while we have remote sensing and we have a whole bunch of other digital technologies that can get us information that we couldn't otherwise get, those are not substitutes for in-person survey data. Been working with the World Bank on these LSMS ISA phone surveys. You can't do a 2-hour phone survey. No one's going to stand the line for that. So, even when you do phone surveys, you have to adapt. There's no substitute for going to actually sitting and talking to a farmer. And we're always going to need to be able to go and do that. And that's going to give us a much richer picture of what's going on the ground, a much richer picture of how people are responding than we'll ever get through electronic or digital means. All right, that's my soapbox at the end. Now we have 25 minutes for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is open. I guess you unmute yourself and provide your feedback or questions.
And if you are asking a question, if you could turn your camera on, that would just make it a little more of a conversation. Val and Renaud, I don't know if you guys can turn your cameras on.
You have some compliments from Rashid, for example, but I'll let you read that in the chat window. Floor is open to all of us to raise questions. Do you want to go ahead?
Aminu.
Aminu? All right, go ahead, Johan.
No, hello.
Hi.
I didn't unmute myself.
All right, sorry, Aminu, let's go with you first.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending where you are. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I think it's not common for what we are doing. My only question is, you mentioned on the last slide that the remote sensing is not going to show the impact on the welfare. So how are you thinking to link that? Because definitely what we are interested is to see the impact of these technologies. One comment is regarding the lack of the data. Jeff mentioned that for many of our technology, we don't have those historical data. I think the CG, in general, we are working with the countries, and the mandate to have this long-term data is institutionally from the countries. So it's not really easy for the CG to manage and to collect this data at the country level. For instance, if you take the CG center are not producing the certified seed, nor the foundation seed. Sometimes we are only producing breeder seed. So it's not really easy for us to monitor. I think this is a very important point. If we need to change it, then we need to see how to work with the country where there is already a lot of challenge, because you have some institution where there is no computer. So how do you work with that? So I think that is very important to take into account. Thank you.
Yep, great points. I'm going to touch on the second one first. Yeah, I mean, I agree that, the countries, all the countries that CG centers are working in, they lack the capacity for that sort of data collection. But also, it's the same reason, they lack the capacity for a lot of this basic research and technology development. They have the capacity to disseminate or breed the seeds once they're developed, but like the CGs are there to assist and to assist countries and contribute to the global good. And data collection, especially social science data collection, has never been a part of the CG, is not a part of the CG mission currently. And so there's this gap. You have, the countries can't develop these new seeds on their own, so the CG helps out. Countries can't collect this social science data on their own. Maybe this is another place that CG centers can contribute to the global good. I don't know. I'm not the one setting policy at the CG centers, but that's what I completely agree with you, Aminu, that that the countries kind of, ideally would be responsible for it, but they lack the capacity, and maybe the CG centers and the impact assessment and monitoring, evaluation, learning people can contribute to that. And then, yeah, remote sensing, people use nighttime lights to try and, estimate GDP. I have my own problems with that. But yeah, you still need to, be able to get on the ground and be able to talk to people and be able to find ways to measure income and wealth and well-being, food security, things like that. And so that's what kind of Val pointed out. We do have this RMS survey, and we will go, if we move to phase 2, we'll go and collect a third round of that. So what we'll do is we'll match the remote sensing data with the household data that we have. And so at least for the subset of regions where we have household data, we can say, well, this is what the remote sensing data says. This is what the welfare impacts are where we have household data. one can do a back of the envelope calculation and say, well, this would be the larger scale. That sort of calculations has a whole bunch of caveats, but in this situation, kind of the best we can do.
Can I add just one little thing? Yeah, remote sensing can detect yield, for instance, if we're talking about welfare, but you can't detect income. You see, it's one an example of so yield is part of the welfare, and if you have a higher yield, you would have obviously a higher income. But the income is also dependent on the cost that you need to actually grow your crops in terms of input, in terms of labor, in terms of a bunch of other aspects. So some indicators which are land dependent could be eventually detected. As I mentioned, we've been working on integrating crop model with satellite systems to actually get to yield in a quite robust way. But of course, the pure welfare side, money in the pocket, that's not something that the remote sensing will give you. Just to give a little bit of nuance on that aspect. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Johanna, would you like to go next?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Yes. Well, thank you for this great presentation. I enjoyed the three section, and it was very instructive and super innovative work. So I really enjoyed it. I have one question. In fact, three questions. The first one is about rice mapping. If there was any tests that were done with Landsat data to see if there's the challenge of cloud is really a big problem for monitoring rice area. The second question is about the innovation itself. So it was mentioned that the rice resists the flood for 14 days, but then how to account for it, or the possibility of the rice being lasting if flood lasts longer. So and what's the possible issue with that? And then my third question is about the flood location and flood index. I noticed that a lot of the rice monitoring survey data is in a section that seems to be less impacted by flood. Anyway, there seemed to be a region that was even more impacted by flood, but there seemed the overlap with the rice monitoring survey didn't match that good. So yeah, how do you think could be could another phase focus more in that area, or yes? So
Yep. I'll let Renaud answer most of those. I'll just speak quickly to the 14-day thing. Yeah, we can see how long floods last, and so if floods last more than 14 days, then we're not going to be able to pick up whether STRVs were there, because they will die and look like everything else. So that is an issue, but we can pick out where those long duration floods are. Renaud, do you want to take the other two?
Thanks, Jeffrey. At least the first one. No, we have not tried yet. Kind of formally to use Landsat. What I can tell you, we've been working at IRRI across Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia quite extensively, and this has been really a big issue to such extent. I mean, the cloud issue, and which has been affecting sensors like Landsat. If you look at, for instance, 15 days revisit, 120 days during the monsoon seasons, you would have maybe 3-4 images of Landsat, and you're very likely also to miss the beginning. It is a kind of a contentious issue because it's never black and white. But because of this, actually, we've now completely shifted. And I know in this case, we're looking at past studies, so the radar is a bit of a problem. But for that specific reason, we've been completely shifting to full radar systems for monitoring rice in the region. So the new system we're using are based on only SAR technology, which is not cloud sensitive, which basically means if you're promised one image every 5 days, then you've got one image every 5 days, no matter what. And you've got that information. You've got this. You can build this time series. We could actually do a test. I think it's an idea, and that's why I mention it. But I'm not personally very hopeful. No. Now on the flood issue. I think one of the things we need to look at, obviously, is to try to and the duration. And again, this has implication. Your question has actually implication with the frequency of the revisit of the satellites, because if you detect a flood at a given time, that depends on the image that you get that given day. If now you've got a revisit 15 days later, so you've got a gap of 15 days. So you can have actually a flood occurring between one day after you got your satellites going and finishing 40 days after, while the next return of the satellite is not actually done. So when it comes to actually fine-tuning the detection of the flood duration, which is critical in the survival of the crop, and things like that, it's a challenging issues, but something that we want to look at is to try to actually see how we can, for instance, work with the start of seasons and see when the flood occurs, and using that information, we can detect when actually which phenology the crop was when the flood strike, and having further information about the likelihood of damage. Obviously, when the flood strike is important in terms of damage, no, and survival of the crop. So that's the type of things that we're looking at. The last question, yes, I actually showed that because I find it interesting, but I've not been working on this survey. Maybe Val can comment. I think definitively having a rice crop map and having a flood intensity map might help, and really to focus the next generation of field work in the future. I don't know, maybe Val, you can comment on the past.
Just a quick addition. The rice monitoring survey, the way it is designed, actually covers the stress-prone areas in general. So, there's going to be a lot of variabilities in terms of the flood occurrence in all these areas. But, primarily the target is toward those stress-prone areas.
And stress-prone can mean not just flooding.
Yeah.
Have a question from Marcel?
Thank you, Ricardo, and hello, everybody. Thank you, Jeff, Val, and Renaud, for this very interesting presentation. I have two questions here. One relates to the attribution of the technology to CG. So it seems like that you make an assumption, and maybe it's not an assumption, but it seems like it's an assumption that all stress-tolerant rice varieties are kind of related to the work that IRRI and Africa Rice have been doing. I mean, dating back to, decades ago, probably a lot of breeding work has been done, etc. So I wanted to hear a little bit about, about that. Maybe it's a very easy answer, but maybe there's actually a little bit more to it, especially because SPIA is also very much interested in the attribution to CG. So my second question would be, it's really interesting work, and I was really, enthusiastic, and I thought, great, I can use this as well for my own work. And then, Jeff, you presented something on, this impact assessment technique is very technology dependent, right? So we can't do anything for orange or sweet potato. That makes sense. But I was wondering, maybe the study team can comment a little bit on, the usefulness of this, the remote sensing for maybe identifying other important traits and the impact of other traits, for example, like late blight for potato, wheat rust, maybe not so much that are very, like abiotic stresses, but more maybe also like biotic stresses. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Marcel. Bandari, can you, either Val or Bandari, can you speak to the attribution of STRVs to IRRI?
Yeah, Jeff, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Good to see you.
Yeah, so let me talk about the attribution of the varieties to CG in the context of Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, there are 5 flood-tolerant varieties have been released. And if we talk about all the stress-tolerant, there are 17 varieties. But since let's talk only about the flood-tolerant varieties with today's seminar. The 5 varieties released, and out of that, 3 has been developed by IRRI, and then these are just directly released by the national system because IRRI cannot release those varieties. And for the 2 varieties, it's the parental materials were from IRRI, so there is a direct link with those major contribution of IRRIs in terms of developing those varieties. That's why we say that although national system is involved, so we recognize definitely it's in partnership with the national system, but in terms of access to germplasm variety development, it's big contribution from the IRRI or the, let's say, CG center. Thank you.
Thanks. Good to see you. So the second question, Biotics says, yeah, I mean, Renaud or Tom Evans on the call can probably speak better to that, the technology. From my view, yeah, anything that should be visually identifiable at least a 30-meter, resolution should be able to, be picked up. I've worked in improved chickpeas in Ethiopia, and there the older varieties have white flowers and the newer varieties have purple flowers. Obviously, you're not going to be able to pick that up from space. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential and promise, especially as more radar-based, fewer optical-based sensors get put up there, and the resolution continues to increase. I don't know, Tom, you've worked on a number of different projects. Can you speak to, what's possible, what sorts of agricultural technologies can and cannot be picked up?
Yeah, basically anything that is associated with the overall what's called above ground biomass. That's going to associate in most cases with yield, and so that works well. The cases where it gets trickier are things like fall armyworm, for example, where the worms actually just eat the maize itself, but the biomass of the rest of the plant is okay. That's where you get into some kind of contradicting signals where the vegetation might still be high, but the yield is low. But the other point I would make is that this work is like the remote sensing technologies are advancing all the time. And now we see this big transition where, yeah, the Landsat archives and the MODIS archives are open and lots and petabytes of data available. But there's also been this transition towards private companies like Planet Labs is producing, very, very high resolution data. They have what's called a constellation of satellites that are up instead of individual satellites. There's clouds of satellites that are up. And so the volume of data is only going to get better and better in the coming years because of this transition towards private companies. And yeah, you have to buy the imagery, but these private companies understand the benefit of a social mission. And so there are grant programs and you can get those data, even though you have to, if you're a for-profit company, you have to buy the data, but for applications like this, there's ways to get the data to basically supplement the free sensors.
Okay, so I think.
Question. I have a question for the SPIA folks. Is buying that sort of data something that SPIA would fund? Could we build that into a grant?
I don't know that we want to take a commitment of that sort here.
The short answer, Mina, is that this is all of these evaluations are cost-benefit evaluation. That seems pretty obvious. I think James had a question, Mina, so maybe you can come in before we finish. And Kyle also, so that's the order there. Sorry.
Yeah, hi. Great presentation, gang. Thanks a lot. I had a couple of quick questions for Val. I wanted just to hear a bit more about the challenges of getting the kind of early generation seed data that you got, the foundation seed flows, and when it hits kind of private sector companies in particular, where that what that looked like in terms of your ability to actually access those data. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more on that. With Jeff, I wanted to actually kind of just look ahead a bit, and obviously your major contribution in this presentation is just the array of different approaches you brought to measurement. But looking ahead to identification, I just, we're both on Twitter. We both follow how many papers are coming out on diff and diff all the time, right? And you mentioned a simple diff and diff, but this is kind of fairly complicated context for diff and diff. And so I wondered whether you were thinking of, using staggered timing. If that's the case, whether you've been kind of trying to keep up with how many different papers are coming out all the time of the new approaches there, and if you wanted to just, if you'd already digested any of that, had any thoughts, I'm just interested to hear it. But great stuff. Thanks a lot, guys.
Okay, if I can go with the first question. Stephen, thanks for raising that. If you ask me honestly, this is actually where the biggest challenge is, because as a private company, most of the time they're not willing to share this kind of information, and that's the difficult part of the work. At least in Bangladesh, so far with the way we work, we have been able to build trust and then work with some of them. The challenge is still ahead because although with the pandemic we haven't been able to hit the ground and start collecting the similar information in India, from the information I'm getting from our contacts over there is always that it's going to be very difficult with the private companies because there are several issues there. Do you really want them to release information about their sale? You have to know there's also implication regard to tax and many other things, and they always like to keep those secret and for their own. So to me, this is where the biggest challenge is.
Bandara, you did a lot of the actual.
Add some more to share.
Yeah, Val, maybe I can add a little bit more, being on the ground. In terms of this breeder seed data, these are just developed by the organization, and since we have been working with those organizations, so if you have a good trust and relationship, you can easily get those data, and you can get time series data. But the problem comes once it goes to breeder seed, because the research organization only responsible for breeder seed. Then it goes to some of the national system who is responsible for seed production for the foundation seed. And still there, it's a limited number of organizations, although their record keeping system is not very good. So that's one of the challenges when you talk about the time series data. When for last 1 year, 2 years, it's easily available. But because their record system is paper, and then sometime one person collects, and after 2 years he transferred to other place, and record system is not good. So when it comes to time series data, the record keeping system is not good. So that becomes a little bit more challenging, but still when you visit more frequently, when you have good relation, you can retrieve those, but it will require a lot of efforts, multiple visits, building relation, trust with them. So that's still okay. But the main challenge comes when it goes to from the foundation seed, it produces the truthful level seed. That's where the many organizations involved. from the foundation seed. Private companies are involved, and some are small, some are large. That's where, and they produce at the national level and they distribute to the different locations. So when you need to get the really which location the seed went, the spatial distribution. So that's one of the challenge, collecting by the geography, where is the distributed, and also since there are many small seed companies involved. So like in Bangladesh, almost 350 small seed producer associations are there, from the small scale to large scale. So capturing from these small scale the seed companies, that's the main challenge. From the big companies, we can easily collect. So you have to make some sort of rough estimate for the small based on these big companies. So these are some of the challenges we face in terms of collecting the seed data. Thank you.
Thanks, Mandari. To James's other question, yeah, in the EOI, we kind of just threw out, we can do a simple difference in difference, and that's kind of what I said that is what I said in the presentation itself. And by that, I simply mean like we're gonna compare both within or between and across, right? Within and without. We want to be able to econometrically look at differences treated versus untreated, and then within treated cells before and after, and within control cells before and after. There's obviously, as you said, there's a lot of new work. Some of it goes back to David McKenzie talking about using ANCOVA as opposed to the classic diff and diff to get more power. But there's an article in Journal of Econometrics that just came out talking about how if you're doing diff and diff with multiple time periods, we've been doing it wrong the whole time. So there's a number of new things to think about, especially in terms of the time series aspect of this. Usually I do, we're looking at microdata 3 or 4 time periods, but here we have potential 20 years of data. And so you begin to get into, time series issues with that sort of high level of T. And then that doesn't even begin to account for the fact that if we're looking at, if our unit of observation is grid cells, we really need to be thinking about this in a spatial econometric framework, because there's clearly going to be spatial correlation from cell to cell, right? And some of that is going to be due to the fact that there's measurement error in it. So yeah, so there's a number of kind of in the weeds econometric issues that we will, have to address or be addressed. All right, focus right now is really getting on, getting the data that we need in basically showing, course correlations within that data. Like, are we picking up the signal that we think we should be picking up? Sorry, that's kind of a pushing you off to tomorrow answer.
That makes sense. Thanks a lot.
Carl, do we have time for Carl's question, or you have another question, James?
Jeff, I think Kyle had to leave to another meeting, but his comment is in the chat, and it basically says, read his AR paper again, because you want to look at the non-flood year impacts too, and how does that factor into the diff and diff. So he didn't obviously say, read my AR paper again. That's my concern.
Yeah. So that's why we're looking to get more and more years, because we need the non-flood seasons, we need the flood seasons, we need the STRV season, years where the STRV wasn't there, to get that variation both within and across. Yep. Behavior response. Yeah. No, that's a good one.
Wait, I want to make sure we still have a moderator, because the time we're a bit over time. So Amina, you did great.
Okay, I don't see any other hands raised, and I was also reading Kyle's chat. So I think with that, we should really give a virtual big hand to all three presenters, and thank you for spending time with us and walking us through the steps of this entire process and demonstrating how challenging it can be, but yet also how that provides opportunity for addressing some questions when we don't have good quality data. So thank you all once again, and until next time.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.